Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
Okay, David. Well, you know how last week we talked about taboos?
Yeah, you think we should talk about something that's a taboo topic?
I think we should. And you know what? I think I just came up with one. This wasn't staged at all.
Absolutely not.
So, let's talk about abortion.
Abortion. Yeah, that's, I don't know, that's sort of like a half taboo.
Depends.
You know, it is something that's talked about on the news, so it's not quite so taboo that people don't talk about it.
True. And I think really the topic may not be so taboo, but maybe the stance you take on the topic. And I also think there are places. Okay, I'll give an example. I think it's a taboo topic in the workplace.
Yes, although really you could say that it's a taboo topic in the workplace because highly controversial political topics are taboo in the workplace.
True. Okay. Well, how about this? I do think that when you talk about, the reason I would call it taboo is because it's something you wouldn't bring up in a light social conversation normally. Like if you meet somebody and say, "Hey, so abortion, am I right?" Like, I don't think that would go over very well.
No, probably not. Well, I could still challenge that, but then I feel like we're going to spend the next half an hour talking about what is and is not a taboo.
Sure, and we talked about that last time. So, well, let's get into the topic a little bit because while it is prominent in the zeitgeist or whatever you want to call it, the common conversations today, I do think it's an interesting topic because for the life of me, when you hear people, I feel, commenting about abortion, a lot of the time, I feel like you see groups of people talking past each other a lot on the issue. And it's a hot button issue that you don't often hear people talking about changing their minds on either, which for me is the greatest indicator that there's no real debate happening. Because generally speaking, when debate happens, the ideas get shared and ideas get to compete on nothing but their own merits. It's not who's talking about the idea, it's just the idea itself. So whenever you see a bunch of people arguing, they just get ingrained into their own corners and echo chambers start forming around that. But when you see something like this happening on a national scale, I find it very difficult to find even some of the more moderate, influential figures talk about this in a way that I feel like is accurate of what we're really talking about. So in philosophers' fashion, let's talk about what we're talking about, and that is abortion. So we'll start off with the Oxford, as usual. According to English, there's the mass noun of abortion. The deliberate termination of a human pregnancy, most often performed during the first 28 weeks of pregnancy. There's also the medical term, the specific sub-definition for the medical, which is the expulsion of a fetus from the uterus by natural causes before it is able to survive independently.
So basically a premature birth that's too premature.
Sure, or a miscarriage, for instance,
Right.
would be considered an abortion in the medical term, according to the Oxford. And then the second one, a biological definition, which is the arrest of development of a seed, fruit, or other organ. And then there's a second main definition, which is an object or undertaking that is unpleasant or badly made or carried out. I think that's when you use it to describe something that's not the medical procedure. According to the Oxford, the word originated in the 16th century. So this is not necessarily a new word. However, I think if we were to take slices of the dictionary back through the decades, the primary definition would not have been there. Mainly due to the fact that the technology to perform this procedure safely and more commonly is new. And when I say new, I mean it's been made widely available recently. Because sometimes it doesn't really matter if you can do something. Is it cheap enough and safe enough to do on a common scale? That's when you really see it come into fruition. So, what do you think about those definitions?
I think those are fairly accurate definitions. I don't have any disagreements with the definition for purposes of this conversation.
Okay. I would like to comment on these definitions a little bit. I feel like the first definition is a transitory definition. For example, I'm going to reread it. The deliberate termination of a human pregnancy, so it's specific to human beings, most often performed during the first 28 weeks of pregnancy. Well, that's another narrowing scope that honestly is useless. Why does it matter for the definition how often something occurs? How often do you see that in a definition? In the actual definition, you'll hear it sometimes in the usage or maybe in notes about its usage, but this is in the raw definition itself. Like, the definition is this rarely occurs. And I take issue with that a little bit, because when you start defining something like this, a specific thing, and a part of its definition is its commonality, with the exception of things that strictly talk about commonality, like the word commonality.
Well, I don't think that piece of the definition talks about the rarity of the incident. It's just saying, when during a pregnancy is this normally done, if it is done. I'm struggling to come up with an exact example right now, but there might be a word in the dictionary that maybe a name that you call somebody who occupies a position, or maybe an insulting name, and it might say especially toward a woman or something like that. It just and in that particular case, it's telling you about the word, that it's giving context to the word for someone who hasn't heard it before, that this is a word normally used when discussing a woman or something like that.
Right, but this isn't discussing when the word is used. It's discussing when the activity is performed.
Right.
I think that's a pretty distinct difference, personally.
Yes, it is a distinct difference, and I predicted that you would retort with that. I don't think that it's egregious, though, to put that there. I fail to see what's misleading about this.
Well, I don't think that it's inherently misleading. That's not what my charge would be about it. What my charge would be about it is that I feel like it isn't emblematic of the truth, necessarily. For example, most of the time, in the natural course of human language, words acquire their definition due to their commonplace. Very seldom do you see a word listed as prominent or commonplace, and then it filters into the society. This, to me, feels more artificial. I personally feel like this definition, I'm not trying to ascribe an agenda necessarily to who wrote this definition and by the fact that it was accepted, but I do feel like it doesn't adequately represent the truth. And by putting a qualifier of the time frame, and as we get into the discussion about abortion, we'll discover that time frames become super important for some people. By adding the qualifier to the time frame, this itself, by definition, begins taking a stance that could be used in the discussion or the debate. I personally don't agree with it. I personally think it's a bad definition. I will agree, because to me, you can stop at the deliberate termination of a pregnancy. The second one that I don't necessarily agree with is human pregnancy. However, I do think that one's more justified because no one really talks about aborting a horse. or a cow. You know, I think that's just because we don't normally do those things. But so I can let that one slide if you want to be that extra level of specific, because but it does create an interesting case where, well, what is it called then when you terminate a horse pregnancy? It's not an abortion by definition. What is it? You know. But I feel like, because the word abortion would still apply if a fetus was aborted at 29 weeks, it's still just as adequate of a definition then, or at, I almost said 50 weeks, but I don't want to go longer than the actual term of pregnancy. That seems like a bit too long.
It is too long.
Yeah.
Anyway, the thing is that the reason I let it slide is because it says usually, right?
Right.
So that doesn't mean that after the 29th week, it's no longer an abortion. It's just atypical.
Right, but the frequency of occurrence, in my opinion, shouldn't be a part of the definition.
I agree.
So and again, I'm not attempting, I don't have the effort nor the resources, nor have I done the research to prove otherwise, but that would make me curious to do the research on, well, let's see how the definition changed over time.
I agree. I think the real problem here is not necessarily that the dictionary is putting something like that in there. Like, it's not, I don't ascribe an agenda or anything like that to it, or that they're trying to force an implication, but that, suppose statistics changed, we shouldn't have to update the dictionary.
Right. And the other,
because whatever we're calling an abortion should still be the same regardless of what the commonplace action is.
Sure. And so I guess, and the reason I also brought it up is because I do often hear things to this level of nitpick get brought up. So I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't just avoiding that, and it's being honest, to be honest, because it bothered me. So now that we've kind of settled on, because I will accept the definition for the sake of debate, even if I disagree with it, because it's still pretty accurate to what it is, depending on what your beliefs about it are. But, I'm fine with that. But I just wanted to point it out and spend 10 minutes on it, apparently. I want to just get to the heart of the issue, okay? I don't want to say who thinks what about it. Whether or not abortions are right or wrong, or whether they should be legal or illegal, in my opinion, is the wrong question. The root question surrounding this issue is the personhood of an unborn human being. Are they people or are they not? Or, if you want to get more specific and less black and white than that, at what point is a person a person?
And which, as it turns out, is an extremely difficult question to answer. And my favorite analogy for this, which I don't think was created for this purpose, but it's still a good one. And I've used it many times. If you hold out your empty hand, and one grain at a time you add a grain of salt or sand or whatever to your hand, how many grains until you have a mound of sand or salt?
That's a good question.
The answer is it's all totally arbitrary. It's a, and I hate this. It's a you know it when you see it thing. You can look at a collection of grains of sand and say, this is a mound of sand, and this is a few grains of sand. But you can't tell me where the exact cutoff is. Now, I mean, I guess technically we could conduct an experiment and show people various numbers of grains of sand and ask them, is this a mound of sand or not, and see where the cutoff is. But I have a feeling that this would vary a lot from person to person.
And it's incredibly subjective,
Right, and the point is that all we're measuring is just what people subjectively think. We're not, but that's the thing, is that the term mound is, it's kind of vague anyway. Yeah. And so the same with the definition of a person. You know, we know that a fetus will eventually develop into a person, and we know that what it started out as was not a person, but we can't find the in-between point where it changed.
I do agree. I think that's the primary. That's really the debate. But when you hear the debate online or in person, people actually talking about these things, that's never what they're talking about. They're always talking about, well, I'm going to make one quick, well, I guess two generalizations. If generally speaking, pro-choice people generally, asterisk star star, generally talk about the rights of the person carrying the pregnancy, the opposing side generally speaks about personhood, but it's more about, a lot of the arguments come generally biblically or religiously, or they come from a moralistic standpoint on it. They assume one outcome of the actual debate of the personhood.
You know, what I should have done, I knew that this existed, and I forget exactly where it is. I think it's somewhere. It's in the Old Testament for sure, in the books of law, in which God actually orders an abortion, and I find that absolutely hilarious. That the people who are most adamantly pro-life because it matters and abortion is evil, that God actually ordered this on at least one occasion.
Right. But I do think going forward, you could take as a general standard that using religion in an argument that like this is generally a bad idea.
Right.
And so, but when you see these points being argued the way they are, of course they're going to talk past each other, because one is talking about personhood and the other is talking about rights of that's the angles they're coming at it from. Now, just because one side is talking about personhood doesn't mean that the reasons they lay out for personhood are good. But at least, because I don't want this to sound like I'm taking a side by pointing that out. I do have my own opinions, but the reality is, when we're talking about the topic of abortion and how we discuss that topic, we don't discuss that topic well in the public discourse. So that's, I think, where the biggest problem comes from. Now, since we've identified where the problem's coming from, and that is the ideas of personhood, as David pointed out, what even is personhood? And we could go to the Oxford for this, but I know it's going to be a disappointing definition, and it's going to be one of those things that you know when you see it.
Well, and just like we mentioned previously about something else, the dictionary means to say what most people mean when they say a word. But when we're trying to get really philosophical and get down to okay, but what does it really mean? The dictionary no longer becomes helpful here.
Right. If anything else, the real definition of what we're talking about is kind of up for debate.
Right, because we're trying to decide what the definition should be, and so looking at what the dictionary says it is totally irrelevant.
Exactly. So, that being said, I would like to go ahead and start from what you had talked about. And that is, we know what a person is. Okay, we're talking about a pregnancy. We know a pregnancy begins as not personhood, and we know that it ends due to its natural progression into personhood most of the time, if it survives pregnancy. So there's a 9-month-ish gray area on, but when person though, or when is this happening? A couple things. So where can we go from that? Starting there, I think generally what I would want to do is begin identifying, okay, let's look at something we know is a person, or we all consider to be a person, and maybe try to find the identifying characteristics of a person. Granted, this might be a vain effort, because anyone could say anything about what makes that a person to them, and you've just done nothing but waste a bunch of time, IMO. So what do you think about using that method?
Yeah, I think that's going to be... So in mathematics, we have a term called a proof by exhaustion. That's what this is sounding like, and proofs by exhaustion are the worst things ever that you could do. Not because they're bad, but because they are so tedious, and often there is a better way. And you know, because like, okay, let's take something that I think is a person. Okay, an adult human male is a person. Okay, and then we could say, okay, an adult human male without any mental disabilities. And he also wears clothes. And like, there's so many things that we could say. And it's like, okay, but of all of these, which ones actually matter? Like, as we start taking away these aspects, which one do we take away that makes it not a person anymore?
Right. That's a hard question. I mean, I think I could speculate on it for a while, but I don't know that we would get very far with it.
I don't think we would.
Oftentimes when we reach a point like this, we also like to talk about why it matters. I think we should hint on that a little bit.
Oh, right. It matters because we already have an intuition that killing a person is wrong. You know, it's called murder. Well, okay, killing a person who has not aggressed you, at the very least, is wrong. We call it murder. And so if it can be established at which point during a pregnancy the fetus achieves personhood, then at that point it becomes wrong to abort. Because at that point it becomes murder by our other definitions. So that's why it matters, is because if we can ever identify that, then we have the answer to our question. And so, but then again, there is still the nuances that are brought up by those who identify as pro-choice, which is that it's murder if you're not being, threatened by the person, right? If someone is threatening you and you kill them, it's not murder; it's self-defense. Now, I'm not about to make the case that babies are trying to kill their mothers and that an abortion is an act of self-defense. But there is the case to be made that the difference between, because a question that's often raised is, okay, how come, if we take the hard stance that a baby is not a person until it has exited the womb, then what has changed based on the what about the baby has changed between being inside and outside the womb, aside from its physical location? The answer is not very much. But one thing that's important is that the baby, once outside the womb, at least in our current culture, and aside from some very specific scenarios, is no longer burdening the mother. The mother has to bear the burden of the pregnancy throughout the pregnancy. And so in this way, the baby was taxing the mother physical resources in order to sustain itself. Whereas after the child's been born, someone else can take over. And that's what's often said about, well, what if a woman doesn't want the child? Well, somebody else probably does want the child. Okay, but until the baby is born, the mother still has to bear the burden. And there is some aspect of that burden that cannot be taken away from her either. It's not just like the monetary cost or anything like that.
Well, okay, it's at this point that I kind of want to talk a little bit about, there's a interesting thing. I would tend to agree that eliminating burden is a good thing, and that a person should not have to unwillingly carry a burden. And I don't mean that to call the pregnancy a burden necessarily, But
Well, pregnancy is a burden, but women normally accept this burden willfully.
right, well, okay. What about comparing? Okay, pregnancy is a naturally occurring phenomena, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That's a dangerous road. Never mind. Well, I was going to say pregnancy results from a choice
But that's not
most
always.
of
But
the
that's
time.
not always true, right?
Okay, but okay, then I guess that raises for me a question about does okay, does it matter how the pregnancy occurred? Then,
To me, it does.
okay. Since we're getting into our opinions on it, I think, so we've been pretty fair in laying it out. Why does the way by which it occurs matter to you?
A couple of reasons.
Okay.
Well, and yeah. So, in the example of the woman decidedly did not choose to become pregnant. Okay. And by this I mean, for all intents and purposes, rape. Okay. A rape pregnancy. Okay. So then there are two things in which in which this particularly matters, because since the woman did not choose to assume this burden, then I find it hard to hold her at fault for wanting to relieve herself of the burden.
Sure, I can understand that.
Right. And then on a second level, and this one I've done a lot of thinking about, but there is still room for sway here. That I find it at a deep level disgusting to essentially reward a rapist with biological success.
Okay. So my next question, I guess, would be, does your answer to that question, does the personhood of the fetus matter? Up into in that case of the unwilling case, say that for some reason I was able to provide to you evidence to your own satisfaction that a pregnancy was a fetus had personhood, and you agreed, would your outcome on that answer change?
As stated, no, but then I have to question myself a little bit here, because, then it depends on which reason I'm going with. If it has to do with the burden,
No, I'm talking about
yeah,
specifically
I
the
know.
instances of the undesired. I don't want to talk about the other one yet, necessarily. I'm talking about just in the instance of the undesired pregnancy, because from the aspect of burden, it's irrelevant, because in the instance of the undesired pregnancy, it's really an authority issue.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm not meaning to cut you off, but I'm trying to make sure you understand that I'm not trying to apply this in the broad sense
Right.
right now. I'm trying to target the specific point.
Right. So, no, I don't think in that particular context, no, I don't think that I consider it.
Okay? In that case, may I offer an alternative
Okay.
situation? A woman is raped, and she terminates a different woman's pregnancy. Or kills a baby, like kills an already born person. Or kills a living person. Really, the age doesn't matter. Once we've verified that personhood, if I could prove to you...
And we're talking about any random person, not the rapist.
Right. Like,
because if she kills the rapist, then we have another variable here.
Right. Well, any person not the rapist.
So she becomes pregnant against her will, and as a response to this, kills somebody. No, that's not justified.
Okay. So, and I'm not trying to call it out so much, but for me, I understand that there is a difference between the random third party and the pregnancy resultant from the crime. Right?
Right.
So, for my mind, if they're both persons, they are all afforded the same rights and everything. They are equal in the eyes of whatever law and morality. So what traits does that pregnancy hold, if we agree that it's a person, that changes its rights or classification to being sub the person who's already born? And I understand the point of their existence consequence the reward for the original offender, genetically speaking. But to me, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that in that sense. For instance, if my father were a serial murderer and I had just been born, he is rewarded through willing, now granted this is through a willing partnership, say, with a person with the biological reproduction and passing on of his genes. His act does not justify my murder in the case that I'm already born and the fact that he's a serial killer, So for me, it's hard. I feel like there's a discrepancy there. Now, I'm not saying I know what the answer is, because the concept of a rape-born pregnancy is very complicated, because you have essentially two crimes potentially being committed simultaneously. But I don't know. I don't know that either of us have the answer necessarily, because we're just stating our opinions, and we don't claim to be the arbiters of truth by any means. But for me, I feel like that's logically inconsistent, that if we were to take all three parties, and the thing is, you can't really take all three parties and obfuscate who is who, because they are all linked together. And they have to they have to be in the place they're in for the situation to occur. Does that make any sense? Or, because for me, I don't believe in the sins of the father type thing, and I know that's not exactly the point you're advocating, because the personhood of the fetus is irrelevant necessarily in the view of because you can really split it into two views. There's the pregnancy as a result of rape, and you're not considering the fact of the motherhood at all in this necessarily, about whether or not the personhood is allowed to be violated.
Okay, so it occurred to me so your problem with this is that hypothetically your father is a serial murderer, and so because we don't want that behavior to be rewarded biologically, we kill you, right?
Right, because that's essentially what you're saying, if I'm not wrong. I don't want to miscategorize your argument.
Well, at some level, that's what I'm saying. But at a different angle, the thing about the fetus in the case of a rape pregnancy is that we'll call it a child. That child was never supposed to exist, and exists solely because of a misdeed. You don't. That had things gone the way they were supposed to, we would not be in this situation. But you would still be here, whether your father killed people or not.
I don't know. To me, that starts sounding like, I don't know, that's strange. Because to me, it's like never was supposed to exist if things were gone the right way. Because, and that's where I was going to make my argument earlier, is, some things you can't really define what would be the right way or not. And my problem with religious authorities, they would say it is the right way because God intended it, perhaps. And I take issue with that because for the same reason. You can't know what is meant to be, necessarily. An absurd example would be a person getting hit by a large gust of wind that contained genetic material that got them pregnant. That wasn't supposed to happen, but it's not a crime. The other was also not supposed to happen, but is it a crime? You see what I'm saying? Like, I'm trying to break it down and deal with one aspect at a time.
Okay. So this hypothetical, fantastical situation of genetic material, airborne genetic material, impregnating a woman. That was unexpected, but it wasn't wrong.
Okay, so the fact that it wasn't supposed to happen is irrelevant. It's
that it was wrong for it to happen.
Okay, so
it's wrong for that child to exist.
Okay, because I'm just wanting to chip off what really doesn't matter. Because if it's wrong, it's wrong. It doesn't matter if it was happening or wasn't supposed to happen or wasn't supposed to happen. Irrelevant. It's wrong. So, okay, so now we're just down to a crime was committed, thus resulting in a pregnancy. So
right.
That's what's wrong about it. That's at the heart what's wrong.
That this pregnancy exists purely because of wrongdoing. Yep.
Okay. Now, I'm assuming the choice now is the woman who is bearing the pregnancy, she still retains the choice to terminate or not.
Right.
Okay. Why does she get to determine whether it's right or wrong?
That's a good question.
Because if it's wrong, it shouldn't matter if it's wrong. Now, then again, the wrongness is her willingness, because the wrongness occurred for her willingness to consent to sex. Well, concerning his disregard for her willingness to participate in sex. Now, don't get me wrong, tacitly, that means unwillingness to conceive a child with as well. But because of the quirk of biology where females carry pregnancies, she really gets the choice in this case because he was forced upon her. And I would argue, what about the opposite situation? A woman forces herself on a man in the way of a rape. Can he have the authority to terminate that pregnancy? Because he was wronged.
I think he should, actually.
Yeah, I mean, by that logic, yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's strange to think about because it doesn't.
But that's and it seems harsh, but that's because I admit that I have a harsh stance on this. That I think, I'm borderline in the position that I think that rape pregnancies should be mandatorily aborted. I'm like right there. And the primary thing that's coming to mind that stops me short of saying that the woman who is unwillingly impregnated doesn't have a choice as to whether to abort it is for the psychological damage that it might cause to, if she decided, well, I do actually want to have this child, and quote unquote society says, well, you can't, and now we're going to perform this medical procedure on you that you don't want, and so then at some point we might be committing a second wrong there.
Okay, because I'm going to give another example that's less personal. I enslave you and make you work, but every bit of money you make I put in a bank account for a year. At the end of that year, someone comes and frees you, stops the slavery from happening. Speaking of another taboo. So at the end of that year, all the wealth that you generated was wrongfully generated, technically, by me forcing you to generate it. Are you entitled to the wealth after you were freed? Or not? Because by the same logical train, unless there's a differing factor, which these are pretty different, but, it doesn't have to be slavery.
I was going to say, because at that point, because at this point we're talking about property, and so then we have to think about, okay, even though this wealth was wrongfully generated, whose wealth is it?
You generated it, but I made you do it.
Yeah.
So you unwillingly made it.
Okay. So in that case, it's mine, and I can choose whether to keep it.
Okay.
Right.
So in the case of pregnancy, whose baby be it? Because that's another thing.
The unwilling participant, that's whose baby it is.
Why?
Oh, for purposes of making the choice.
Okay.
Because, biologically speaking, it's both of theirs. It's the victim and the assailant.
Right.
But we don't care about that for this context.
Because I think that's another topic that kind of goes along with this, because it does get brought up in discussions oftentimes that, abortion is good for people who cannot deal with the baby after it's born because they would put them in a financial situation they could not support themselves in. Right?
Run that by me again.
Some people advocate abortion for those who are in a situation in which a pregnancy would force them, air quotes, into a situation where they would be financially disadvantaged and or be essentially a drain on them after they're born. Now, I disagree with this argument.
Right, I disagree with that as well.
But
the problem there is that if the mother then is willing to put up with the intrinsic burden of carrying out the pregnancy, then the case does become legitimate that somebody else would want to take care of the child. There are, couples who can't have children, for instance.
Sure. But I guess the point I'm trying to get at, though, with that was, at what point do children stop being property? Or are they ever property?
This is a good question.
Because in our discussion on responsibility, which we called in the principle of property, for example, and property yields responsibility, which yields authority in that chain of logic we laid out. Well, you are responsible for a baby human that cannot be held to responsibility for itself. Ergo, it's your property. Well, okay, but does property precede that? Well, in my opinion, it has to for responsibility to be valid. Now, granted, this is a really pragmatic case, and you can't necessarily apply the metaphysical, but I don't see anything wrong, because we already treat children like property anyway. You cannot do certain things to another person's child, like even a school, for instance. Like, you cannot punish that person's child without their parents' consent. You have to get consent of their authority to do anything to or with them. And we reserve the right to the parents to do these things. So I think that adds another level of complexity to it. And I think that level of complexity goes all the way down to the basic principles of, can we logically determine, is there a way to, can you create a system that's logically coherent that would determine yay or nay for the personhood of a child? Even if you don't know the specifics of it, if you laid out saying, if I could check this box, the following events would be logically consistent and hold up in other circumstances, I guess is what I'm saying, from a principled standpoint. Because in this case, you also have to ask the question, people own themselves as well. So it's almost as though you're not a person until you're able to take care of yourself. However, that case draws a line that's way after pregnancy as far as when it's considered murder.
Right, because a young child can't take care of themselves either.
Right, and right now we prosecute people who kill their children before they're 4 years old harshly, I guess that what I'm trying to get at is there's a lot of different logical trains that they really start breaking down over this issue of personhood. And I think some people approach it from well, let's just define what a person is. Okay, good luck.
Come find me when you do, because I want to know.
And I want to put you up for a Nobel Prize, because that's insanely impressive, if it's legitimate. But I think one thing that often doesn't get discussed is what we're kind of talking about right now. What are the implications of the possible outcomes? I think there's a case for personhood from conception, personhood from time of X, which is, well, actually, that's really what personhood from conception is. It's personhood at X time. So before this time, not person. After this time, person. And you really think you can take those and extrapolate out, applying a principle that you would apply to any other 35-year-old person, apply it to the fetus/baby. When does it start making sense? Same thing with the intersection when you have the concept of property, and go out to 4-year-olds. What makes, is a 4-year-old a person or not? Like, we assume they are because you just know it when you see it. Like, yeah, that's a person. But why? If they are a person, then why are their parents allowed to have absolute authority over them? Is that just a pragmatic measure that we take because that's just kind of how you have to do it?
But parents are not allowed to have absolute authority over their children.
Right now, due to the law. which we've problems with. But
Well, okay,
there-
but well, not even because of the law. Like laws in this case, not all of them to be certain, but at least some of them exist because there is widespread social agreement that parents do not have these rights over their children. And I don't exactly want to go into details about those kinds of things.
I do think that would make a really good discussion for a separate time to talk about why are children so special,
right?
And break logic everywhere.
Right. Because they're not fully people in the sense that we don't apply the responsibilities to them that we would to an adult, but they're not fully property either, because we do afford them certain rights that are not afforded to what is unambiguously property.
May I make a proposition at this time? Because what you just said is the same problem with a fetus as well. Because it's the same thing. There's just an event that happens that we stop calling it one thing and start calling it the other. It's an arbitrary event. Really, when you really think about birth is not that special, really. It's existed since for 9 months before that, and it will continue to exist, and it continues to grow over all of that time. Birth does not stop or start anything, because you could take the baby out before it was supposed to be birthed, and it would still be the same. And arguably, you could apply technological standards all the way down to the moment of conception, and it could be viable. I hate that argument because that has nothing to do with whether or not it's a case-by-case basis, and B, it has really nothing to do with the biological capabilities, right and wrongness, or personhood. It's really more reliant on the technology. Sorry, short tangent, but I wanted to clean that one up real quick before I moved on. May I propose that there is a duality to children that continues throughout an entire person's life, right? This duality exists, but it's a constantly shifting ratio between what degree you are property and what degree you are an agent. And we have decided that at the moment of birth, or wherever right now we colloquially accept abortion okay, the moment beyond that is when the ratio flips to being more person and less property. And as one increases, the other must decrease. Like they're not independent of each other. The more of a person you are, the less you are property. The more the property you are, the less you are person. Right? And free of any other agents acting on you, you will progress along this scale. Well, yeah, free of any other agents really acting on you to hinder that, you will decrease in property as you age, and you will increase in personhood as you age or mature over time. So I'm proposing essentially a dual sliding scale that is affixed on a ratio that shifts over time. And this, I think, might be a decent middle ground, because you can then justify abortion by the logic. It satisfies the logic, essentially. Now, normally, logic doesn't like sliding scales like this, or you don't see them very often, but I do think it could be applicable here. Because, you could really make the argument as well, at what point does a person become so personified that they are absolutely no longer property? Because you can make the argument that before they're conceived, they are property. The egg and sperm are just property. And granted,
well, at some level, we even consider them to be part of, whichever parent we're talking about. And so they're, not external property, but like the most property something can get, it's part of themselves.
Are we talking about in the child or in the...
We're talking about in the case of sperm and egg.
Okay, gametes, okay.
Yeah, right. So,
right, but
a mother's eggs are literally a part of her.
Right, but you own yourself.
Right, exactly.
So
but you
it
own
is
yourself.
property.
So right, so it is right. That's what I mean. Is that it's not property like my cell phone.
Why not? People sell eggs and sperm all the time.
No. It's not you're cutting me off first. So
Sorry.
It's not property like my cell phone. It's even more property like my arm.
Right. Okay.
It's even worse to take that away. It's the most property that property can be is a part of yourself.
Right. Okay. I actually really am liking this idea. I might play with it more. Because I think that speaks more to the truth of the situation as most people would perceive it, even if they don't like using that terminology. I don't think anyone likes talking about a person as property. That's a touchy subject, TM slavery, but I think there's truth to that, because, and you can kind of see it past birth when you start looking at the way we generally define maturity, arbitrarily define, well, not arbitrarily, but colloquially kind of could define maturity as the capability to take on additional responsibility, and those responsibilities include responsibility over yourself. As you become more responsible for yourself, which I think is pretty synonymous with maturity in a lot of ways, maybe not exactly, the less you become property. You stay property, but you become your own property at that point.
Right.
I don't know. But I do think we'll have to go here. Like, the discussion about abortion needs to go to these places. It's not simple. You need to look at it from, first of all, personhood. I think, additionally, property both need to be really well ironed out. And depending on, if you have really ironed out definitions for these things and they form a logical, or your core belief set, you can see how these things extrapolate into this problem of abortion. I'll call it a problem because it is. And I know before I had talked to you about one solution that I think that you agreed to was that technology could solve the problem of abortion if we could make viable a literally seconds before conceived fetus. If you could extract it and raise it artificially, removing all burden from, well, not all, but most of the burden from the mother, at that point, you could skip the issue of personhood, essentially, and let it, and you know what I mean? Like, it's a workaround to the problem. It doesn't necessarily solve it morally, because, the concepts of personhood draw on your morality, or help form your morality, I would argue, since morality is how you treat other people, or how you believe people should be treated in their interactions. But that's a half measure. That doesn't really solve the problem. It just goes around the problem. I guess I spoke out of turn on that. Would you still agree with that idea that it would definitely make it it would give you an easier problem to solve instead if you could just remove both parents from the equation like that and isolate the third party as a separate unit, not tied directly to either of them in any physical way?
Maybe.
Because I do feel like there's also the human psychological component that makes this difficult as well. This is an issue that's hard to rationalize. And there's a lot of things intersect at abortion that make it hard. And you have to cover all of the axes first before you can, I think, adequately address the core issue. And if you have a difference with someone else on any of the axes that form this occurrence, you will disagree on the, what the perceived outcome should be, My brain hurts just thinking about it, So we've I guess, would you agree that there's a property axis, a personhood axis so far we've lined out. I'm curious, could you think of any other things? There's a morality axis but that kind of derives from personhood. So that's an offshoot. We don't need to necessarily go down that far. The implications on morality would be more of a result of your decision than making your decision. So, property and personhood. Anything else?
I don't guess so.
Not at this moment. Oh, man. I have to let that sit for a minute. I don't know. We talked a lot about what you believe on it, I guess. And a lot of it has been me probing questions towards what you started out with your opinion. I guess I can offer my opinion to wrap up a little bit. I mean, it's somewhat been conveyed in my question asking, but not entirely. My opinion is that, well, opinion at the beginning of the night, because I feel like I need to adjust and reevaluate a core belief system before I can adequately address this problem. And it would be insincere of me to do so now with what I'm thinking about before I validated it internally. That caveat being said, at the beginning of our discussion tonight, I was of the opinion that we did need to determine personhood alone. And I didn't have the answer. And I had it narrowed down to the same gray area we arrived at, which was, at conception is where the gray area begins, and at birth is where the gray area ends. Everything during pregnancy is gray for personhood. And my stance on abortion comes from a very cautious attitude towards denying personhood. I oftentimes would rather err on the side of giving something that's not a personhood than something that isn't, something that isn't a person, And that's really where my personal, if I had to pick a side right now, someone gun to my head, and if I didn't just choose one of these things I would have to say, that's what I would say. It's not a religious reason. It's definitely not because I think they're a person, but because I really am at 50-50 confidence on whether or not it is or isn't. However, I really do not like, I really would not want to err on the wrong side of personhood, because at that point it's, I think, one of the most egregiously immoral things you can do, because it's a justification for the violation of rights of a person or an agent. So I'm not necessarily, the more I've read about people who have done things like that, the more gun shy I am about it, because once you've eliminated the personhood of an agent, rightly or wrongly, they then fully become property or potential property. And a lot of these other taboos we talk about, like slavery, that's a result. Slavery could not have existed without the denying of personhood for as long as it did, I think. I don't know that. I'm not an anthropologist, but it's a lot more comfortable, I think, for people to be on board with the idea if they deny personhood. And that's what they did. That's a fact. You can look at history and see what was written and how they spoke about slaves. They were not people. They may be humans, but not people necessarily. Because you can make the same claim about that's the argument made, is that yes, this is technically human matter, but it's not a person. It's the same thing. It's the same style argument. And I know that there are a lot of pro-life people that use the same, they'll say what I've said as their justification, and they like to drag in things like the Holocaust, which I think is a very unfair comparison. Because I think the way I put it doesn't necessarily ratchet up attention, And I think that's one of the worst things we can do. And I get it, people who, if I look at the logical train of thought for people who think that these are people, I could understand the logical conclusion that this is like a Holocaust. Just because it's logically consistent doesn't make it true. We discussed that a long time ago. But I can also see the logical consistency in the argument against. The pro-choice argument, they're both logically consistent from their initial conditions, but their initial conditions are not addressing the same question, in my opinion. So, I think that's kind of all I have to say about it from my perspective, and honestly, I think I have a lot more to think about. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so too. I think there's a lot to think about. So abortion is one of the things. I have a few I have a few topics among the things that I'm confident about. I have a few topics that I am very unconfident about, and have never, or at least not in a long time, have felt really strong convictions one way or the other, and that remains the case. Um, you know, I expressed a harsh stance earlier, but that doesn't mean that I am very enthusiastically in support of that position. And so it remains that way after this. That I'm not sure.
Sure. And I think that's the most important thing too. I wasn't trying to change your mind, and I know you weren't trying to change my mind. In reality, I think we both may have gotten more to think about that might get us closer to the truth than when we started, and that's a good thing. Now, I would caution anyone that trying to have a discussion like this with just a random person is very unlikely to end the same way. Because it is, and that's why I think I would consider it a taboo, is because it's a topic that once you engage in a discussion with a person over it, it is highly likely that your interlocutor will become immediately dug in on it, because because socially you kind of have to be, because it's such a hot button issue that people are armed to the teeth with their reasons for why they believe it, and they're so ready to defend their position that they may not know why they even hold the position.
It's not even the danger of that is not even that they're so ready to defend their position. It's that they're so ready to condemn you for not being totally on board with their position.
Right. That's a different thing, and both of those things will occur, but one of them is a lot more unpleasant.
Because I don't mind if someone is very quick to disagree with me, but it becomes more personal than it ought to be once someone starts condemning me for disagreeing.
Right, because then
by merely questioning their conclusion that I have done some sort of wrong.
Right, which that's essentially an ad hominem, is what it is. But to them, it's a justified ad hominem, And that goes for both sides. I know there are probably people who are listening to this that are on either side of the opinion, that when we talk about the other person labeling and castigating, you immediately will imagine people who have maybe done that to you or seen it done to people you would agree with, but I assure you it's something that happens for both groups of people. I think it's fair to say that you and I each represent the loose camps of the different sides of the debate on this. Maybe we're a lot closer to the center on, than I know for a fact, this is right or wrong. But I think we both run into people who are on opposite sides of the aisle, and it's been that way. I know I definitely have. Not that my personal experience is any evidence, but, I just wanted to offer the fair warning. I don't want anyone to go out there and get told they're wrong for existing or they're bad for having an opinion or an idea. And I guess that's also one of the reasons why I would consider this a taboo, is because you could be labeled as being morally wrong for just holding the opinion, which I think is kind of what we were alluding to when we did speak about taboos, or at least it's along the same lines. So, very cheery topic. 10 out of 10 would do it again, for sure. I don't quite know how we can lighten the mood on that one, and I don't think that's necessarily our responsibility. So, any last remarks?
Nope. I think we've come up with some things to think about, and hopefully have inspired our listeners to do the same.
I would agree, and I do think this might be a topic we revisit someday. And I hope that it's one of those topics that might draw people to open the dialogue with us about it more, because I really am interested in this issue. I think most people have a really strong interest in this issue, but it's so difficult to find people to discuss it that you would disagree with, that it's cordial. Or
the issue is very important to people, but people are not ready to think about it oftentimes.
Exactly. They're ready to either defend or attack their opinion or the other opinion respectively. So, okay. Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.